If you're making a ton of changes to support environmental protection, you'll want to make sure that your money that you have sitting at your bank isn't funding the destruction of everything that you're fighting for. So unless you have specific investments with a portfolio manager and all that jazz where you can choose what your money finances, then the money you have in the bank isn't actually just sitting idly by. If you have 1,000 euros in a bank account and you're not investing it in anything, then 90 to 97% of that money is actually traveling around all over the place. My bank is sending my deposits left and right instead of letting them just sit idly by in that account. And that's how banks make money. That means that my money has a carbon footprint that varies depending on how the bank is deciding to lend that money. Everything is computerized, and my money is actually being taken by the bank to finance the bank's projects without specifically telling me what those projects are and without me having any control over it. So banks can loan out a majority of their resources. Depending on the country, they have to keep at least 3 to 10% of their clients' deposits. So if you can put 1,000 euros in your bank account, they're allowed to spend at least 900 euros on loans, which are spent on buying goods and services which you have no control over if you're at a normal bank. So the overwhelming majority of banks are not transparent. You can't find out easily who they are giving out their loans to. And we'll talk later about a few banks that do decide to be transparent. So where exactly are banks putting our money exactly? What's happening to my 1,000 euros? You ready? When you put your money in the bank lends that money to finance the local economy, but also multinationals, states, and other banks. And they want to choose projects that are profitable and reliable for them. So they finance coal, gas, and oil, as well as insurances that are insuring the coal, gas, and oil projects. French banks finance 10 times more fossil fuel energy projects than renewable energy projects. A 2018 Prudential Regulation Authority review shows that 70% of banks realize climate change poses financial risks, but only 10% of banks manage these risks with a comprehensive long-term view. A recent article from November 2019 talked about the addiction of French banks to fossil fuels. Oxfam and Friends of the Earth, Les Amis de la Terre, denounced the colossal carbon footprint of French banks. The report states that in 2018, greenhouse gas emissions coming from financing activities in the fossil fuel sector of the 4 main French banks, BNP Paribas, Crédit Agricole, Société Générale, and BPCE, reached 2 billion tons of CO2, which is 4 to 5 times the emissions of France. BNP is the bank that supports the most polluting projects, followed by Crédit Agricole. This was through loans to fossil fuel projects and investments in shares in companies like Total. So French banks are supporting projects from fossil fuels, nuclear energy, and large dams abroad. They don't loan money to French projects in France that are dirty like this because of the legal risk and risks for their reputation. So instead, they take advantage of the weaker environmental legislation in countries abroad. So BNP Paribas, for example, is investing in oil sands in Canada, natural gas projects in Papua New Guinea, a petroleum project in Russia, shale gas producers like Total, coal projects in South Africa, a coal plant in Turkey, another coal plant in India that the local communities were actually against, and the giant RWE German coal group, which is the top European polluter in the private sector. And in fact, Swiss banks, UBS and Credit Suisse, are also funding this project. The 3 of them invested about 2.4 billion euros in this RWE project between 2016 and 2018, and they try to keep these investments hush-hush. And the crazy thing is that BNP Paribas calls itself a responsible bank that supports the fight against climate change. And I wish it was the only French bank that was this bad, but Société Générale and Crédit Agricole also invest in the same sorts of terrible projects. And I used French banks as an example here, but banks around the world aren't any better. What exactly are US megabanks lending money to? Well, in 2010, the Rainforest Action Network showed that US and Canadian banks like Bank of America, Citi, JP Morgan Chase, and RBC were financing tar sand extraction projects. And Citigroup and Merrill Lynch were found to have financed through the Three Gorges Dam in China that destroyed wetlands and displaced 1.4 million people. And in 2012, a cool finance report came out by the Rainforest Action Network, the Sierra Club, and BankTrack called Dirty Money, US Banks at the Bottom of the Class. This report ranks the top financiers of mountaintop removal coal mining and coal-fired power plants. Mountaintop removal mining is when the tops of the mountains are literally blown off to find coal. This practice has destroyed about 1.4 million acres of forests and mountaintops. And the top banks responsible for this in 2012 were Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Citi, Morgan Stanley, Wells Fargo. Those were the filthy five. Now, according to an October 2019 analysis by the Rainforest Action Network, which studied Bloomberg financial data and company disclosures that are publicly available, the world's top investment banks gave the fossil fuel industry over $700 billion between the 2016 Paris Agreement on climate change and mid-2019. So the top banks financing fossil fuels are JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo. So their billions are funneled into coal mining operations, oil and gas companies, fracking firms, and pipeline companies. JP Morgan Chase in particular has provided $74 billion to fossil fuel companies working on fracking projects and Arctic oil and gas exploration. And fracking has also received $80 billion in financing in 3 years from JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo, with much of it going into Texas fracking projects. So these numbers have been updated since the April report called Banking on Climate Change. And if you step back and look at the international picture, between 2016 and 2019 alone, 33 banks financed $1.9 trillion in fossil fuel projects. In 2019, the Rainforest Action Network released a document called Banking on Climate Change that is well worth a read. They made a great website where you can view by sector which bank is funding what. And you can also see who is financing fracking efforts, Arctic oil and gas, or total fossil fuel financing, and so on. So this is the same graph as you can find on fossilbanks.org, which is another great resource. Barclays, the UK bank, is beginning to decrease its financing to the fossil fuel industry. In 2016, it provided $13.1 billion to fossil fuels, whereas in 2018 it was $5.2 billion. Even more good news, in January of 2020, Barclays shareholders have challenged the mega bank to divest from fossil fuels that are accelerating the climate crisis. These shareholders represent 11 pension funds that manage £130 billion. It's the first resolution of its kind to be filed against a European bank, and it will be voted on in May 2020. I briefly mentioned the fact that your carbon footprint is influenced by the bank you choose to put your money in. There's actually a calculator that was put together by various French nonprofits where you can plug in the money you have with which bank and if you have any specific investments and so on. And based on that, they'll calculate your carbon footprint. Now, I can't say the numbers were legitimate because they seemed quite skewed, but regardless, this pressure on banks to be more transparent about the climate impact of their loans and the pressure to meet the Paris Climate Agreement goals is working. In September 2019, over 50 banks and financial institutions that represent $3 trillion in assets said that they would assess and disclose the carbon footprint of their loans and investments through Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. So it would be a monumental change to be able to know the carbon footprint of your bank. And so far, Dutch banks have tracked the climate impact of their investments and loans and found that residential mortgages were one of the areas of highest carbon footprint. So they began promoting mortgages with incentives for energy efficiency, which is incredibly exciting.